Yeah, so it's been a really strange time, hasn't it? So
Are the libraries open again? Some are and
yeah,
some aren't
so
they?
most of ours are open now. I think, oh, we are live now. We are
Oh,
definitely live. So good evening, everybody who's watching. A few little technical glitches tonight, but we are now live with Anna. So I'd like to say thank you and welcome to the audience to our latest series in our events from Exeter Library. And tonight I'm really pleased to be talking to Ana Sampson about her books. This one I have here, which is She is Fierce, and I know that Anna has got her other one.
I've got a sneak preview of the new one.
Sneak preview of She Was Sore. And that one's out on the 17th of September.
Yes, that's right, later this month.
So you have written, you're a poetry anthologist.
Yes, so I don't write poems. They are much better than anything I would write.
So how did you get to be to become an anthologist? How did you sort of, I like to talk to people about their booky roles, but actually I've not ever spoken to an anthologist before, so I'm quite intrigued about how you became one.
It was a slightly random sidestep, actually. So my kind of now other day job is as a publicist for books, which I've been doing for nearly 20 years. Child labour laws were very lax in the early 2000s. And so I was head of publicity and marketing at a small independent publisher, and we had a very successful range of books which all dealt with things that you kind of half remembered from school. So, I used to know that was one of them, My Grammar and I. And we always used to brainstorm ideas. And I said, well, I think we should have one of poems that you kind of half remember. You might remember water to water everywhere, nor any drop to drink, but do you remember what it's from? Do you remember where it comes in the poem? And maybe it'd be interesting to have a little bit of background about the poets as well, because you think, was he the one who was a bit too close to his sister? And, was he the one who was obsessed with the Lake District? And so I thought that would be an interesting addition. And then I said, oh, I'd quite like to have a go at putting it together. And everyone went, and I said, no, I would. And so they sort of let me try out, and I wrote some little biogs of the poets and a bit of sample material and sort of what I thought ought to be in it, maybe. And they said, oh, okay. So
wow, so it was just
I was just there, really, and I think they realised that I was going to be quick and cheap. And I had a brilliant editor who really knew his stuff, actually, Toby Buchan, who's a fantastic editor and knew poetry kind of inside out. So really, he helped me shape it and put it together. And so the anthologies that I did there were quite greatest hits volumes. So we were looking for the best known poems and things that people are really familiar with, and also older poems, so the sort of classics. And so it sort of became a sort of sideline. It was something I did. Like, I edited a poetry anthology in each of my maternity leaves during nap times. So it was a sort of slightly strange bit of moonlighting that I ended up doing. But then She is Fierce came about because I read an article about a bookshop in America, and they turned all the books by men so that they were facing spine out. So you could only read the spines of the books by women, in a sort of very clever visual way to demonstrate how very dominated the book world was, and how very dominated the classics was by male voices. And I read this and felt a bit smug and thought, I read loads of books like that, And then I looked at one of my anthologies, which of course had been very kind of canonical, very greatest hits volumes, and I thought, oh my goodness, there are more poems by men called William than by women in this book.
Really? Yeah.
Yes, I think, in one of them. And I thought, oh goodness, I've been part of this problem. So I thought, well, I'm going to buy like a really general, accessible book of poems by women. It'd be really interesting to see what themes come out. And I sort of wanted to have women from lots of different places and lots of different time periods writing in it. And then I couldn't find one. So I was kind of really lucky that I was in a position where I thought, oh, I think maybe I could sort of fill this gap on my bookshelf. And so that's when I started kind of looking for a publisher for She Is Fierce.
And that did
I
really
just
well.
wanted to read it.
I really liked that in the because I'd actually written that down, is that you said in books in traditionally anthologies are dominated by male voices, and that obviously did draw you to decide that you were going to you know, sort of commission and find to do this book. And then with the success of She Is Fierce, is that what sort of inspired you to do She Will Soar? Because you found, or did you have so much material that you...
Yes. I mean, She Is Fierce had to go from sort of this down to that so that it didn't kind of fill up a whole bookshelf. So I had lots of, when I started looking, I just found all this amazing material and all these amazing women, and some of them had really fascinating stories. You know, we had suffragettes and kitchen maids and, you know, these redoubtable Victorian ladies of letters and, you know, all these really fascinating women who just either they had been, a lot of them had been quite successful in their own lifetime, and then they'd been forgotten or overlooked subsequently. They'd sort of really fallen out of fashion in a way that their male counterparts hadn't. So, you know, there were some Victorian poets that I found, and, you know, Letitia Elizabeth Landon, who's one of them in She Will Soar, she's no more kind of flowery or high Victorian in style than Tennant, but somehow she's not read anymore, she's not studied, she's not made it into that kind of greatest hits canon, and he has, all the men have. So I just found so much, and I discovered loads and loads of women that I'd never heard of, and I thought, well, you know, if I've edited 5 poetry anthologies, I've got quite a lot of poetry books, I've read quite a few poems, and if I've never heard of some of these women, there must be other people who also haven't heard of them, and also more women to discover. So I was really thrilled for my brilliant editor at Macmillan. We were talking about another book, and I sort of said, well, you know, I'd love to do something about poetry as a magic carpet, poetry being able to take you anywhere. And we've never needed that more this year, I feel. In lockdown, finishing editing this collection of poems which are all about freedom and escape and wanderlust. I sort of felt that was the only way I could travel through a lot of that period. But I didn't know whether there would be the appetite for another volume of women, or whether perhaps readers and the publisher and the bookshops would feel that box had kind of been ticked, that was sort of done now. And I knew how much more there was. And actually it was my editor who said, yeah, we thought perhaps, but they could all be by women. And I was like, oh, really? Because I just had so much more. So it was really fun to do this. That was women poets, but had a kind of particular theme and an angle. So I was looking for certain things, and those ideas of imprisonment and escape and freedom, which I think women have just been more constrained.
Yeah, definitely. And I think,
especially in the literary world.
Yeah, and I think they. I was really fascinated by two of the poets in She Is Fierce, which was my favourite, was the Winifred Holtby, you know, the Boats in the Bay, and I loved the little anecdote about her about that she, what did she say, something about
she wrote about mansplaining. She didn't use the word, but she did in some of her journalism. She wrote how much men seem to enjoy explaining things to women. And I thought, there you are, Winifred, 70 years ago, you know, sort of putting your finger on something. And she was someone as well who I knew South Riding, and I'd read it sort of in my late teens, which is the novel that she's kind of best known for. But actually, she was a really staunch political activist, you know, and campaigner for equal rights, and a feminist, and she also wrote all this incredible poetry, which, and I sort of felt all of her campaigning side and her poems had been forgotten. So even if they were remembered, they were often remembered not for the poetry. It was other thing.
It's interesting, isn't it, how you know, how there's so many women, and we've got our stack at Exeter Library, which is like our archive, and we've had an artist working on looking at the sort of the voices of female writers and how they're hidden, and that, I think this definitely demonstrates exactly what you're saying, is that, you know, there was lots of them, but they've just sort of been shoved in a cupboard somewhere or on a bookshelf, and so it's nice that I think you're sort of being responsible for sort of waking them up and bringing them out to see the light of day again.
There were some of them that I sort of read about, and a lot of them, some of them died before they were published. So there's Mary Leaper in She Is Fierce, who's this 18th century kitchen maid, who wrote, you know, she had no formal education. She was absolutely determined to become a writer. She wrote and wrote despite everything that was stacked against her, and she ended up dying of measles at age 24 and never saw her work in print. But actually, you know, subsequently, you know, she did enjoy quite a big readership, and, you know, her poems were printed and published, and so she was one of the people it was just a real thrill to discover for the first time myself, and to hope that other people would find.
That's the thing, isn't it? I think it's almost like opening like Pandora's box of what, you know, you can sort of share with other people, because I'd not heard of, and I really like how you do the little biographies in the back of them, so that you learn a little bit about them as well, because I do a shared reading group at the library, and quite often we do a story and we do a poem, and my poetry is quite limited, I have to admit, but actually it's got a lot better since I've been doing the shared reading group. But even then I'll sort of say, oh, this is by so and so, and they'll say, oh, who's that then? And I'm like, I don't know. so your book's amazing for that, because I can go, oh wow, he's so and so.
Oh, well, actually,
yes, funny you should have that.
There were just such interesting stories as well. You know, I'd love to go and kind of write longer biographies of some of the women, because there was Pauline Murray. So Ruth was one of my favourite poems in She Is Fierce, and I'd never heard of her, and she was the first black district attorney in California. She went to law school and qualified as a lawyer at a time when she was barred from various institutions by her gender and by her race. And she sort of kept pushing and kept on going, and had this extraordinary career, you know, wrote a completely seminal book called States, Laws on Race and Colour, which, you know, sort of was such an important campaigning tool in the civil rights movement. And she was just this fascinating woman who'd had this really long, interesting, eventful life. She'd kind of persevered against all these things that were stacked against her. And I just thought, why haven't I heard of her? You know, why have I never read her? Why do I not know about her? So it was a real pleasure to discover their stories. And often when the stories kind of illuminated, to some extent, the poetry. And I know you can't read everything biographically, and actually that's a problem I think women writers often have, is that everything they write is assumed to be autobiographical and personal.
Yeah.
But there just were things that, you know, shone a light on some of the circumstances in which these women were writing. And even if they were writing and they were lucky enough to get published, which was considered rather scandalous, because what kind of a woman goes and publishes a book and then even worse, publicizes it? Because reading this as a book publicist, just heartbreaking. Just wasn't considered nice or ladylike. It wasn't the thing to do.
No.
So to then, you know, discover all these stories of women who wrote, who published, who kind of got round all the things that were stopping them. So because it was rather shocking, obviously, to go and work outside the home and write a book, Anne Bradstreet, who's named the first poet of America, she had to pretend that her brother-in-law had stolen her book and published it totally against my will. You know, she writes all this, you know, it's
really
ghastly. He just took it and just went off with it. And then you read her poems and she mentions the word fame 13 times in the first 3 poems. You think, I think Anne knew. I think she was there with it. But her brother-in-law still had to write this preface saying, she doesn't know I brought this to printer, and she never neglected her large family and her husband, and she stayed up all night to write, and, you know, to reassure the reading public that she was a good wife.
Yeah, that's just so awful, isn't it? Because a man would never get that type of scrutiny, would he? No, even, you know, things have definitely got better, but even so, the fact that, you know, we're in 2020 21 nearly, thank goodness. And you know, you're still discovering, you know, people that have been hidden for such a long time.
Yeah, I mean, very recently, Sharon Olds, and I think this is sort of late 20th century, she shared a rejection letter she had from a literary magazine in America, which said, if you want to write about your children, you should write to, you know, Ladies Housekeeping magazine.
Oh.
Because the subjects that women were often writing about, which were the domestic and the personal, which aren't the only things that I discovered that women write about, all subjects from politics and science to anything you can imagine, but anything that was seen as a kind of woman's subject wasn't considered appropriate to be written about. It's not a...
But actually, as a woman, and actually I think for anybody, it's really interesting it's sort of an historical account of life, even if it was sort of, you know, domestic or about their children. It sort of just shows you about the time, doesn't it? It's not just words about their children. It's about, yeah, it's just, yeah, I can't really explain it.
Those are the poems by those women that have endured. And actually, Anne also wrote lots of highfalutin epics about classical battles and theology and, you know, the kind of things that were considered appropriate subjects for literature. Those aren't enjoyed as much anymore. You know, those are quite niche. Whereas the more emotional poems about her family and her husband and her children are the ones that have endured, because those are kind of universal things that people can recognize themselves in.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to ask you like a really difficult question now, do you have a favorite poem?
I think it's really hard to answer because they're so different in tone, and it's like songs. I couldn't pick a favorite song. I think sometimes you're in the mood to listen to something weepy, and sometimes you're in the mood for something that makes you jump on the bed and punch the air.
Yeah.
So I think the poems are the same. Yeah, and also because I had to whittle so many poems down to so few to go in. Everything that went in was kind of something that I really loved in the end.
Have you got sort of, you know, you said you have the big pile and you've got it down. So have you got are they all sort of somewhere that you think, oh, maybe
just behind me down there on the shelf, very messily stacked. I think She Is Fierce has gone to the recycling now. My children do a lot of doodling on the back of printed out poems. She Will Soar, even though she's here and she's, you know, out in the world next month, I will hang on to the bits of paper for a little bit longer
just in case. How do you, because it must be really difficult to just like to choose, so is it a personal thing, or is it that you choose a theme? So in She Is Fierce, you've got sort of like love and meditation, and is that how you sort of structure it? Do you sort of think, right, I'm going to do a chapter on this and a chapter on that and then try and find the poems, or you find the
with
poems?
She Is Fierce, it was more a sort of, I like all of this, I like all of this, I like all of this.
Yeah.
And then what have I got and how could I arrange that?
Yeah.
And it went through this kind of skeleton of the book went through a few iterations. I had lots and lots of small chapters that ended up being a smaller number of bigger chapters. And then there were, you know, certain poems that said the same things as other poems or similar things, or had a really similar feel. And then I had to choose of the three that kind of covered that area, choose the one that I felt was a contrast to other poems that we had, and it's sort of about the balance.
Yeah.
It's really hard. There were things that I cut out that I was a bit like, oh, and that was why it's, you know, a few of them made it into She Will Soar.
Like, yes, I'll just
say a poem called The Girl That Fell in Love with a Mountain by Caroline Hardacre, which I loved. And it was on the long list for She Is Fierce, and then it got cut quite late, and I'd sort of been pining after it.
Oh, you managed to get it in.
But actually then, because I'm always reading so much more, you know, of course, the minute that it goes off to the editor, and the editor's like, that's it, we're going to press print on it, then I go, oh, I've just read this amazing poem today. So there's always things that I mourn. But I mean, also, yes, it is personal, and my editor, Gabby, is very good at saying to me, okay, you have young children, but we don't need 19 poems about young children in this book, which is aimed at people of all ages, and we want someone to enjoy it at 12, and we want someone to enjoy it at 102. And
yeah,
although these are the ones that are speaking to you, but
yeah.
very strongly at the moment, you need to rein it in and make sure you're covering other
I find that
other things too.
it's difficult, isn't it? Because when I've done author events and things, you have to try and think, well, actually, I know that I really love this person, but actually, does anybody else really love them? And usually they do, but it's just, you do have to try and, be a bit braver about what
I'm probably the only person who will love all the poems in both these books.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and I think with an anthology, the hope is that it's like a buffet.
Yeah,
you can
just dip in and out.
Yeah, you can sort of dip in and out, and hopefully there's enough that is both familiar. So we have kind of Christina Rossetti and the Brontes, and the Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the kind of big names, Maya Angelou. We have those kind of really recognisable names in there as well. So I hope there's enough that people think, oh gosh, yes, I love this poem. I'd sort of forgotten, or I'm reading it afresh at a different time in my life with new eyes. But also lots of people, so there are some poems written by schoolgirls in both of these. I had a couple of poems from Kate Clancy's English poems from a school. So they're written by students at Oxford Spires Academy, so really kind of young writers, and other really exciting kind of up-and-coming people that it's been a real pleasure to discover. So I hope there's enough that, I mean, not everyone will love everything. That's probably
no, and I think like you said, your favourite.
Hopefully there's.
When I'm looking, it depends on the season. It depends on, what's happening in the world. To what I'll sort of pick out and think, oh, actually, we'll read that this week, or we did September Rain this week because it just seemed appropriate.
Oh yes, I love that.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah.
We did a ghost story, and then I thought I need to balance it. So that's another thing, is about when we sometimes do. I
love the idea of pairing it's fiction and a poem.
It's really good. I mean, and you can be quite brave as well. So if we do something a bit grim, sort of literary wise, if we do something, we did George Eliot, and everybody in the channel, like the child, the brother, and afterwards I thought, it's supposed to be like happy and helpful and cheerful, but then afterwards we did a really nice poem but it was about bluebells or something, and it was lovely, and they were like, oh, I'm really glad you did that, and I was like, so am I.
A palate cleanser.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to sort of be able to do that pairing, and to be brave and be able to sort of pick something quite dark and then sort of lighten it up.
I think poems maybe even more in some ways than fiction. I find that I read things differently now than I would have done maybe 20 years ago or when I was at school, and especially with everything that's happened this year, there were certain poems that I was reading that took on a really strange new resonance, particularly because the section She Was Saw is all about escape and freedom and wanderlust and people feeling confined, and actually particularly women feeling confined. And I'm sure I wasn't the only homeschooling mother trying to work and look after the children who was feeling quite confined. So there were a lot of things that just suddenly had a resonance that I felt I understood. Some of the war poems even, where there's Charlotte Mew's poem Spring, I think it's 1915, which is in She Is Fierce, where she talks about spring will come again, and when we were in very tight lockdown and everything was very terrifying, but the hedgerows near me were kind of violent with blossom.
Yeah, they were lovely.
It was this insanely beautiful weather, and this really jarring distance between the fact that in my life it was sunny, and even though everything was very anxious, nothing was happening. And my sister is an intensive care consultant, so she was very much on the front line. And I felt those kind of poems written by women who were on the home front suddenly you know, they really had something to say to me about what was happening to all of us at the time.
Would you like to read a couple of poems from your new book?
Would. I've got some post-it notes. My post-it notes match the book quite beautifully.
Oh, that's good. That's really good.
So what did I post-it note? Okay, so I've got nice hopeful ones.
Good.
Having said that, this is one called December, which is by a poet called Jen Campbell. And I had another of hers actually in the long list, which I also loved, but this one kind of fitted better in here. And I found it on her Instagram page. So, you know, I've kind of find poems all over the place. Libraries, obviously, I couldn't do without my village library, who have tirelessly ordered in all the endless poetry books from all around the county that I just get my hands on. But I also stalk poets on Twitter and Instagram, and this was one of them that I found. So December. Hope in jars, it lines the shelves. We hug it close to warm ourselves. It's admirable to cling to hope, protest, protect, go out and vote. And when in the morning light, this hope of ours does not shine bright, we coax it back, we mourn, we fight. And I just thought it was so kind of simple, and it's in a section called Courage, Hope and Resilience. I felt it really spoke to the resilience and hope.
That sounds. I think sometimes the really short ones are the more punchy ones, aren't they? They just really sort of.
They really get you there. And also, I'm afraid I hadn't had time to practice any of the longer ones yet, so I've got quite short ones for you tonight. And this other one, this was one that really spoke to me during lockdown, and suddenly, exactly as I was saying, had a new resonance. It's called Locken by Kathleen Jamie, who's just the most wonderful poet, dedicated to Jean Johnston. And she writes, "When all this is over, I mean to travel north by the high drove roads and cart tracks, probably in June, with the gentle dog roses flourishing beside me. I mean to find among the thousands scattered in that land a certain quiet locken where water lilies rise like small fat moons, and tied among the reeds underneath a rowan, a white boat waits."
Beautiful.
She's so good. She's so good. She's someone who I never read anything I don't want to put in an anthology by her.
You're like, you go to her book last because you know that you're going to just find so much stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. When I have 2 slots left, it's not the time to pick up Kathleen Jamie. But it was just the way it opened, when all this is over. And I'd selected it before, any of the events of spring. I was sort of putting the finishing touches to it really at that time. And I just opened it again and went, oh, It was the right poem at the right time.
I think poetry's, and I think that's one thing that I've sort of learned with doing it with the shared reading group is the power of it. I hadn't really appreciated, because I did it at school and then it sort of got shoved away and then I did it with my OU, and then that was the same. It was, you're analysing a poem is very different than reading it for pleasure.
Absolutely. And I do think people get scared off by that.
Yeah.
And when I was studying English literature, I used to deliberately never choose poetry because I actually didn't mind analysing it, but it never seemed enjoyable.
No, I know what you mean.
Really?
No.
And even though I loved lots of the poems that we did at school, we did the war poets because everyone does. Yeah. No one told me any women wrote war poetry, yeah. But there are some I can exclusively reveal. Yeah, and it does. I think it does put people off, and also it puts people off because you have that encounter with poetry, and then you kind of think, I have to understand it. I have to know the context. I have to know why he's put that word there or why she's used that language. And of course, you don't. And when I have given schools talks, sometimes I've used this very embarrassing story, which puts me in a very bad light. night where I was on stage at the Henley Literary Festival on a lovely panel of poets and writers talking about She Is Fierce. And the brilliant poet Deborah Almer, who is also the emergency poet who runs the poetry pharmacy up in Shropshire, revealed to me live on stage in front of 150 people that I had put her poem in the wrong section of She Is Fierce.
Oh no!
I'd read this poem about a young woman sort of declaring independence from her parents and sort of standing on the threshold of her life and sort of about to spread her wings. And actually, she said no. It was actually about leaving, you know, as an adult, a very unhappy relationship. I said, "Oh, Christ, no, it's in the wrong bit. It's in the wrong bit." And she said, "But it doesn't matter.
No,
you know, that's the point." So, I mean, that's how publicly did I get that. Completely misunderstand this poem, which is still languishing in the wrong section of She Is Fierce, because that was how I read it.
And I have a question which sort of links into that. Is, do you think poetry is a solitary enjoyment or a social one?
Oh, well, I would say it can be both. Because I think spoken word poetry and, you know, hearing someone read their poetry is so electric. I think it can just add such an extra layer of excitement. Two people who I've heard read who I think are just spectacular to listen to, Caroline Bird and Nikita Gill. Both of them are just completely spellbinding, brilliant readers of their own work. But also, obviously, I like to curl up with a poetry book on my own and sort of chew it over, and, you know, so I would say both, absolutely. And with my other hat on as a book publicist, we're taking more and more events online like this, and that makes them much more accessible actually to people.
Definitely, yeah, I think we found that. You know, we started off doing it in the beginning as a sort of a trial and to see how it was, and actually, you know, we've managed to get audiences from all over the country, which we just couldn't do that in Devon. Absolutely. And also it was quite it was difficult for us to get authors to Devon because it's a long way from from lots of places in the UK. You know, we couldn't be, apart from Cornwall, we couldn't be a lot further down. So it's been great for us to be able to you know, speak to people from all over the country, but also have audiences from all over the country as well. So like Heather in Shropshire.
Hi, Heather.
And our Debbie is watching too, Debbie runs the shared reading group with me and Dawn at the library. So and she's wonderful at poetry. She's read a lot of poetry and she reads it for pleasure. So I think it's something that I sort of come to quite late because I think I was put off by the school.
I just think so many people are. I'm on a real kind of mission to persuade people that it isn't scary. And I think it's like books as well, that, you know, there are people who say, oh no, I don't really like reading. And I'm like, you haven't met the right book yet. And as a librarian, you know, that's obviously your kind of passion and your role there is to find something for that person. I kind of feel that way about poems. I sort of think you just haven't read the right poem yet.
Yeah, I don't believe that there isn't a book for everybody somewhere.
Absolutely.
To what it is. So it's
I'm
really
wildly biased, but I completely agree.
Well, I think if you're passionate about poetry or passionate about books and words, you will always sort of champion it, won't you? And I do
think poetry is seen as this difficult thing. You know, it's something that it's a bit fancy.
Yeah.
A bit, you know.
Well, it's a bit. I think it can be a bit scary, like you said.
And a bit scary.
Yeah.
But I think that is because we're all sat down in front of a page of it and told to analyse it.
Yeah.
And when you read it yourself, you don't have to do any of that. No one's going to make you answer questions about it.
I've come across them. I hadn't heard of the is it Roger McGough who I hadn't, one of our group brought one of his poems along, and it just made me laugh so much. It was so funny, but I thought, well, I just haven't heard of him before, and it was great. And we share bits with each other as well, so that people will bring along things, and she. It's really nice to share. We've got one member of our group who actually writes his own poetry, and he shares it with us as well, and because it's just that sort of safe space that he can do that, and some of his,
I just think that's what I don't write poetry, and the more poems I read, the more convinced that poets are magic.
yeah.
I think anyone who can, it's just wonderful.
I think, yeah, it's definitely sort of a gift, isn't it, that to be able to make, so, you know, in some cases, so few words be so, you know,
absolutely,
yeah, outstanding and important. And
when I read one that's, you know, you get that kind of jolt,
yeah,
and I think, oh, that's very good. I mean, you've literally taken this much paper and you've taken me somewhere, or you've shown me something, or it's absolute magic.
Another one I liked was The Sun Has Burst the Sky by Jenny Joseph. That one was lovely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she's really well known for Warning, which I think is in She Is Fierce as well, actually.
Warning. Yeah.
I'm trying to think now whether it certainly was on the long list, but When I Am an Old Woman, I Will Wear Purple. And, you know, but now we have to pay the bills, and we have to, you know, spend our money on butter and not on the street, and which is just such a brilliant poem that I remember reading at school and loving and thinking was so funny and brilliant. She's really well known for that, but actually, yeah, The Sun Has Burst the Sky, which is just so exuberant, and I just read it without feeling completely buoyed up.
Yeah, no, it was lovely.
That was a lovely discovery, because I hadn't known much of her other stuff.
No. Heather from Shropshire said, "Hi Anna, this is great." And I don't know if this is her question. Do you think you have to have had life happen to you for a while before you can appreciate poetry, and how well poetry can find the words that find the feeling?
I do think that there are poems that speak to me differently now. That I'm old, but I couldn't go back and tell 15-year-old me was sticking Strange Meeting by Wilfred Owen on her wall that she, you know, that she wasn't getting anything out of it, despite the fact that not actually that much had happened to me by that point in my life.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of, but I do think it speaks to you at different times, at different, you know, there are certain poems that I only kind of feel in my bones now I'm older and other stuff has happened to me.
Yeah.
But I do think that the reason that, you know, we reach for poems at those moments where we need to say something really quite profound, so funerals and weddings and, you know, those, and christenings as well, those occasions where it's a big lot of feeling, and that's when we go for those poems. And actually those poems have stood the test of time because the poets have just managed to put into words better than we ever could ourselves something that's very universal.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, we do go to them for things like really important things like funerals and weddings, and then the rest of the time they're sort of, you know, we don't really look at them. And
I mean, there probably are people who the only time they've ever heard a wedding, you know, a poem is in their wedding, or the only time that they read poetry might have been for a poem for the wedding, you know, something that your mother-in-law doesn't feel weird reading, or, you know.
Well, I can definitely, I mean, I had read His Fist before, and because I've used it a lot at work, and I will definitely be acquiring a She Will Soar for our reading group, because I think
I'm so pleased. There are biogs as well of all the
yeah, and I think that's so helpful.
New amazing women I've discovered this time.
I think that's great. And I think that I think the biographies are just so useful and really interesting as well. So I think even if you just read a few and then just read the biographies there, it's just really interesting.
I just loved researching them as well. I mean, obviously, so She Is Fierce was written quite quickly, or it was edited relatively quickly. Obviously, when I was writing 150 quite detailed, trying to condense these women's amazing lives into I was cursing the fact that I decided this would be a good idea. I was really angry at myself for signing up for doing that. but I have loved it. I really feel like I've just like scratched some little bits of history that I didn't know about, and it was amazing to throw a light on some people who, you know, just hadn't been heard of, you know, and people from all over the world as well.
Do you think it's has there been any that you've sort of thought you'd like to do a whole book about, or are you still happy to do or is there anybody that you've sort of fallen in love with a little bit? And
Pauline Murray was one who I just felt I could go back and read more and more about her, and I think that there are a few. Margaret Cavendish, who was this kind of completely deeply eccentric. She got away with being eccentric and writing lots of books and, you know, appearing topless on the London stage and doing all kinds of, you know, wearing men's clothes and doing all kinds of shocking things, because she was the Duchess of Newcastle. So, you know, she could get away with an awful lot that women couldn't, but she was, you know, really interested in science. She was the first woman invited into the Royal Society. She wrote in all kinds of different genres. She didn't get the kind of highfalutin education, but her husband and her brother were very supportive of her and sort of helped her. So she was fascinating. And Amy Lowell as well, who actually there's a lot of her, and she will soar. I've read lots and lots of her. She's helpfully out of copyright as well, which doesn't hurt. But she was from a very upper class Massachusetts family who believed in education for their sons. And when she decided she wanted to be a poet, she went away and just read for 8 years as the kind of training ground. I mean, isn't that the dream? Just go and read for 8 years. Just sign me up. That just sounds amazing, doesn't it?
I'm going to.
She lived in a mansion with an enormous library of, you know, several thousand books in it, so it was quite easy for her. But she then became, you know, a really pioneering figure who did a lot to popularise poetry, and she was an editor of publications and anthologies, and there were just some really amazing women who you just felt you could keep learning about them. Anna Wickham was another who was, she threw Dylan Thomas out of her house during a snowstorm. I'm sure he deserved it from everything I've read about Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, I was going to say I've read quite a bit about him as well, and I think
I think you might. But she was another really kind of fascinating woman who wanted a singing career, and her husband sort of put the dampeners on that, and she kind of had a breakdown. It was impossible for her to find an outlet and to express herself. And eventually she turns to writing poetry and became incredibly successful as a poet, and, you know, wrote poems that just still today seem really kind of fresh and modern. And loads. I would love to write a kind of joint biography of a few of them and go much deeper into them, but for now I'm just carry on reading.
Well, thank you, Anna. It's been we're nearly out of time. There will be a edited version of our chat, which will be available on our YouTube channel, and we will share that via Twitter and Facebook. It'll probably be in about a week's time, because Callum, who does all our editing, is on holiday this week. So, but he does
well deserved, I'm sure.
But it's been really lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, because we've kind of talked a lot.
We have
Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that. So it's so lovely, if not to meet you, to kind of meet you like this.
Well, we did talk, didn't we, ages ago before, actually, about whether you would come to Devon at some point. So maybe in the future.
One day.
If not virtually again, we can lure you to Devon.
Lovely. That would be the best excuse. Well, you know, we've got to go. Karen's asked us.
Exactly. Yeah, you've got to go. It would be rude not to.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who's been watching this evening. She is Fierce. We have several copies in the library service. I think we've definitely got a couple at Exeter, and I will be chatting to our stock managers about getting some She Will Soar as well when it comes out on the 17th. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's such a pleasure to know that people are kind of reading the poems together as well. That's absolutely thrilling.
Thank you.